Well, good evening to everybody. Now, we've been examining, and I don't need to tell you this, we've been examining the Wisconsin idea as a vision of a partnership. I didn't know about that, but I have my wrong notes. So just a moment.
What if you stick with those notes and I just give a presentation based on whatever notes
Whatever
you have?
I say. Okay.
We can just improvise.
Of course. But since I had spent a little while thinking about the introduction, let me start with a quote. And it says, "Students, faculty, administrators, community members, we all have parts to play in the enactment of the Wisconsin idea. We should always be looking for ways to ensure that the interpretations into the future will be inclusive and impactful." Now, this is an observation posted by one of the participants in this lecture series. And I begin with it because it conveys ways in which attendees, you, have interpreted and incorporated features of the Wisconsin idea into your own lives. Now, sometimes that interpretation has led to particular commitments. One participant, for example, noted that although distinguished visitors, and we have another tonight, although distinguished visitors have shared their experiences, the statement goes on, we have the opportunity to make a difference. By going to talks in our community, we not only better ourselves by acquiring knowledge, but we can make strong connections within the community. The advancement of knowledge is the embodiment of the Wisconsin idea, and the poster continues, I will continue to integrate this intention into my everyday life. The author of that post, incidentally, this followed up the lecture from Professor van der Zanden by participating in the Science on Tap series that he had mentioned. This is the kind of public assessment, engaging the public in issues about the lakes that we talked about. Now, in terms of the kinds of observations, there are very interesting ones that people have posted following last week's film, Outsourced. One of these observations held that citizens have less influence when public universities are privatized. This makes it easier, the observer continues, to forget that these institutions are to advance the commonweal and make the community a better place for everyone. So time and again, the notion appears in the post that the future of the Wisconsin idea depends on how teachers, administrators, researchers, including those who are being developed, it depends then on how people interpret and carry out their responsibilities. Tonight's lecture raises ethical and moral questions related to those responsibilities. Professor Evan Polman joins us from the Department of Marketing to share cautions about roles that might be played. I found it fascinating. Some of his work has found that people are better at making decisions for others than for themselves. One can ask them, what are the implications when researchers propose decisions that actors should take? What warrants attention when indirect means are used to direct actors towards a particular course, or what we know about as nudging? These are the kinds of questions that have engaged Professor Polman over his career, and we're fortunate that he's with us tonight to share his observations, experiences, and knowledge. Again, from the post, people have said there are things we have learned from the past, but there are also things we continue to learn from the present, and thus we are privileged to have someone of his stature to come in and share with us those experiences, knowledge, all associated with the psychology of progressivism, with questions about how do we advance knowledge and ensure public well-being. Professor Polman.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. How are the lights? Do we like it dark like this? Okay, fine. Thank you, Cora, for inviting me. It's such a privilege to be able to be part of this course of the Wisconsin Idea. And thank you all for coming tonight. You could be at home streaming this lecture right now in a lounge chair with a hot toddy in one hand and maybe your phone or a cat in the other hand and with some jazz music. But you decided to come here tonight when we have some kind of impending storm. So please take the most advantage out of it. Just fire questions at me. I don't care if you're interrupting, if you're disrupting. Just pepper the questions at me. I actually prefer it. So take advantage that you're here today rather than in your comfortable homes. This talk is titled The Psychology of Progressivism. And it is inspired by my going on the Wisconsin Idea Tour. And I don't need to tell this group what the Idea Tour entails. We went, for example, to a dairy farm. We went to a prison. We went to a sauerkraut factory. That was a lot of fun. And we went to a high school in Milwaukee. And among the four of these particular trips, particular events, and there were others, the high school was probably the most eye-opening experience or event for me. And the reason for that is because we are at a high school, and the students at this high school, they came from poor backgrounds, and they were very smart. And so we had the privilege, the benefit of being able to talk with these high school graduates. So there was a panel of, let's say, 10 or a dozen high school grads with all of the professors from this Wisconsin Idea Tour bus. And inevitably, one of the questions that was asked to this panel was, what are you guys doing after graduation? And the answers, they ranged from, oh, I'm going to go work at so-and-so, or I'm going to go to a local college. And it seemed fine. These were all good answers. One person on the tour, they asked a follow-up question. And they asked, why aren't any of you, because you're so bright, why aren't any of you going to UW-Madison? And I thought it was a potentially arrogant question, because it was fairly clear from our conversations with the students that they could not go to UW-Madison, not because of financial constraints. They were bright. They probably could have got scholarships. This was before Bucky's Promise, but still, they probably could have got scholarships. They couldn't go for other reasons, for family obligations. They needed to spend time in Milwaukee because it was required of them. They had to spend time looking after their brothers and sisters or after their parents. It was too much of a privilege or of a benefit. It was just too much to ask to go 70 miles west to school in Madison. So I kind of thought, maybe that's an arrogant question. Like, this was someone who did not understand the kinds of constraints that these high school students face. That even if they had the financial resources, they probably could not so easily, compared with perhaps other people on this bus tour, they could not so easily go to UW-Madison. But I think that was maybe the wrong kind of question. It's a bit of a value-laden question, and I don't think this person was mean. I think he was curious, but it did make me wonder if maybe it was a naive question. And I don't mean in the pejorative sense, I mean in the literal sense of naivete, that maybe this so-called expert opinion wasn't so expert. And this begs the question, what happens when people are placed or credentialed into positions into which their judgment is respected? People, they believe the judgment without questioning it a lot, but it might be naive. In other words, what happens when the expert's opinion is perversely not that expert? Now let me remind you of the Wisconsin idea. It refers to the responsibility of the university to serve the needs of the state and its people. How is that actually practiced? Through experts. Here's a very old article, Helping Cities to Help Themselves, how the state university, through its extension division, in placing the practical assistance of experts at the disposal of Wisconsin cities. More specifically, the idea is pursued by experts who theoretically have more information than the non-experts. This is something that we assume. We also assume this informational superiority. It's a maintained assumption throughout, and it's accepted as fact. And if we look at the language that the authors of the Wisconsin idea used, they often use words or phrases like intellectual vanguard, intellectual elite, educational men. This is the language of power. And I think it resembles something that Van Hise himself said. He notes that any great scholar recognizes his official duty as advisor of the state upon the subject of which he is an expert. Van Hise also offers caution. Knowing the frequent tendency of many men to enlarge the importance of their own occupations, I have sometimes wondered if the professors of the university unduly magnify their calling, that of investigators and disseminators of knowledge. And I want to underline and emphasize this particular portion because this is what I want to talk about tonight. That concern that he has that experts might behave in fairly self-serving ways. The kinds of questions that I hope to address in tonight's lecture include, in what circumstances can experts be confident that they know better than the ordinary citizens? What gets in the way of beneficent expert judgment? I also want to talk about what are some of the practical methods that organizations can use to lead people to make decisions that are better for themselves, which I think is consistent with the Wisconsin idea. And then, if we have time, if we want to have some more fun, we can talk about the moral pluses and minuses of these particular methods. Now, in answering the first question, I want you to think about Van Hise's caution. I have sometimes wondered if the professors of the university, if they unduly magnify their calling. I want this to be a lodestar, something that you just have in the back of your mind. As a starting point, let's consider the Council of Economic Advisors, because I consider this to be an example, an exemplar of the Wisconsin idea. It is progressivism, maybe at its finest. The White House, the executive branch, they have a team of economists, economic advisors who tell them what maybe they should do, who give them advice on what they could be doing. This is just a group of voluntary advisors who provide the president with some kind of knowledge or some kind of guidance on what they should do next. And Cass Sunstein, who is an economist, he makes the same expert versus other power distinction that I think the Wisconsin idea sometimes makes, the authors of the Wisconsin idea. He says there are, first of all, people, ordinary individuals, with their heuristics, their intuitions, and their rules of thumb, with their laziness, their impulses, and their myopia. They have choices to make for themselves and their loved ones. And they make some of them well, and they make some of them badly. Then he adds, there are those, the experts, whom Sunstein refers to as we. We know this, we know that, and we know better about the way ordinary people make their choices. He's kind of suggesting that experts know more about what people want than they know themselves. We are the law professors and the behavioral economists who, A, understand human choosing and its foibles much better than members of the first group, and B, are in a position to design and manipulate the architecture of the choices that face ordinary folk. In other words, the members of the second group are endowed with a happy combination of power and expertise. And I think it is this power that we should worry about. I think it is this power that Van Hise worries about himself. So today, we're going to be talking a little about power. What is power? Individuals in positions of advantage, they have access to more wealth and valuable information. So it's the wealth. We can think about financial resources. We can think about informational resources. They have more of it than other people who are at a disadvantage. Moreover, individuals in positions of advantage, they have more control over how these resources are used. This access to and control over resources is definitional to power and also characterizes hierarchy with respect to class, race, and gender. But this talk, as indicated earlier, is about the psychology of progressivism. So what is psychological power? It's the feeling a powerful person has. It articulates how a position of expertise and advisorship, how it influences one's propensity to adopt the psychological orientation of agency. And through this orientation, experiments, they show the effects of power on individuals' thoughts, perceptions, and behavior. Which is to say that expertise, expert power, can instill a sense of advantage within an individual. And a sense of advantage, it is a psychological experience. Could be explicitly felt, could be implicitly felt. It's a feeling that the self is valuable, that the self is important. And this could lead people with a high sense of power to behave selfishly. I'm going to show you a series of experiments, primarily conducted among undergrads. And these experiments, they manipulated people's feeling of power. You might be wondering, how do they do that? It's actually fairly simple. This is just one example here. Participants are randomly assigned a role of either a manager or an employee, so like a subordinate, for a subsequent task. And this has been found to induce a feeling of power, such that people who are given that manager role, they believe they're going to have some kind of power over another person, and then they actually feel like they're in a more powerful state in that moment. And because these are experiments, there is also some outcome variable that is assessed, which allows us to make causal inferences. Because if there is a difference in this outcome variable, then it is plausibly because of the randomly assigned condition, in this case, high and low power. Now, the experiments that I'm going to show you, they're kind of stylized, they're kind of basic, and that is actually a benefit of conducting experiments because they allow for that cause and effect relationship. That's a plus, but they have downsides too. They are not as generalizable as, say, other methods of doing social science. So they have a benefit of showing cause and effect, but they have the downside of not being as generalizable. So I'm going to show you the studies. They're very simple, but there are other methods that are even more generalizable. However, they have the downside of not being able to show that cause and effect relationship. And I'm showing you experiments because that's what I do. That's my bread and butter. I'm a psychologist. Here is a simple demonstration. And in this case, we've got a high power group and we have a low power group. And they were asked to buy chocolates. And there was one additional condition. They were either buying the chocolates for themselves or they were buying the chocolates for other people. Let's see if there was a difference. In the high power group, they bought more chocolates for themselves than they did for other people. What about the low power group? They bought more chocolates for other people than they bought for themselves. This shows that power might affect the psychological utility of self versus others. If people feel powerful, they believe that they should get the resources. They are the valuable person. But if people don't feel powerful compared to others, they don't believe that they should get as many resources as other people. They would prefer to buy resources to furnish and provide benefit to other people. Here's another demonstration. This was an experiment that was conducted on the goals that people would endorse. So in this study, the participants, they endorsed a range of goals. Some of the goals were selfish goals, self-oriented goals. They were about how much do you care about recognition or achievement or mastery. Some of the other goals, they were more communal-oriented. They were about how much do you care about helping others, serving humanity, serving community. The results show that among the selfish goals, high-power people endorsed them more compared with low-power people or just baseline people, people who are not manipulated to feel either a low or a high sense of power. And for the communal goals, the high-power people did not endorse them as much. Both compared to the low-power people, they endorsed these communal goals more, and also compared to their high-power compatriots who were endorsing the extent of selfish goals. And if you want more evidence, here is a study that was conducted on the effects of power on perspective taking. And there is a very fun and novel way of measuring how much does someone take someone else's perspective. That novel method is writing an E on your forehead. Now, if you look at Adam here on the left, he wrote an E from his perspective. Like, we are all outsiders. It doesn't look like an E to us, but it would be an E to him. He drew it from his perspective. If we look at Joe here on the right, he wrote an E for our benefit. He wrote it for our perspective. And people who feel powerful, they are almost three times as likely as low-power participants to draw that self-oriented E. This means that high-power people, they don't care about other people's perspective. They just assume that you're going to get it, that you're going to get it from their perspective. Research has also looked at the effects of power on distress and compassion. In this study, participants, they discussed an event during the past 5 years that delivered them a great deal of emotional suffering and pain, such as relationship conflict, family conflict, or mortality. And then they discussed this event with a listener participant who was in either a low-power condition or a high-power condition. And then the outcome measures in this study were listeners' distress. How distressed, how stirred up was the listener in this story? Also their compassion. How much compassion did they feel for the person recalling this particularly distressful event? And also, ECG was used. ECG is a physiological measure, in this case, of physiological anxiety. So it's a different kind of variable because it's not self-report. By measuring physiological anxiety, we're able to test whether there isn't just a feeling that is different, a subjective feeling, but also a physiological, biological difference between people who feel power and people who don't. And the effects are consistent with the other results, that among people who feel power, they are less stirred. They are feeling less distressed by hearing about someone else's problem. They also are less compassionate compared to someone who is in a low power condition. And physiologically speaking, they are different. They don't respond with the same kind of anxiety as low power participants do when they hear someone else's distressing and anxious-laden event. The next study, it looked at inclusion. And this is an interesting study because it's really about how much do powerful people care about other people's opinions. Do they consider them? Do they integrate them into their own judgments? In this study, the participants, they completed a boring task. And then they were asked to rate how enjoyable or interesting was this task. What's interesting about this particular study is that the participants could see others' faked ratings, which were all positive. So it's a little like they were asked to evaluate the task, and then they could see other people's ratings of the task. They were completely fake ratings. They were all positive ratings. This was, remember, a very boring task. And the question was, would people with power, would they change how they report their interest, their enjoyment of the task, based on what other people ostensibly say? So I want to show you first. There is this dimension, this rating. This would be the conformity mean. What do I mean by that? I mean, this was the mean judgment rating of all of those other judgments. So it's very positive. From 1 to 10, it's near 10, but it was not an exciting, it was not an interesting task. Baseline, we know that it received about an 8 out of 10, which means that it wasn't nearly as enjoyable as other people made it seem. This was assessed by asking participants, how interesting is this task? But they did not get to see what other people thought of it. So you can consider it to be an unbiased assessment, like an honest assessment. It's what they thought of the task without any kind of social influence. But what happens when we do insert some social influence? Low power people, they change their judgments. They believe it was an interesting task. So do no power people. That's just an example of social conformity, that people's judgments, they tend to be based on what other people think. But conformity appears to have less influence among people with high power. They do not conform as much as other people. When they get to see other people's opinions about a task, they don't seem to care about those opinions that much. They just report based on what they think the task is like. And finally, I have one more study to show you before I go on, and this was an experiment on hypocrisy. Would people with power, would they have a different bar, a different standard upon which they use to judge other people's transgressions or misdeeds compared to their own misdeeds? In this study, the participants, they responded to 3 moral dilemmas about either themselves or somebody else. The first one is, if late for an appointment, is it okay to break the speed limit to make the appointment on time, given that there is little traffic on the road? How acceptable is that? The second dilemma, is it acceptable to emote additional wages that one earned in one's spare time from a tax return? How acceptable is that when you do it versus when someone else does it? And if someone who needs a bike but has no money to buy it, is it acceptable to keep an abandoned bike rather than bring it to the police? So these were all high-power participants. Would they have a different standard for others compared to themselves? And the answer is, of course, yes. When it comes to the speed dilemma, they believe it's more okay if they speed compared to when other people speed. When other people speed, they gotta be punished. For the omitting wages, it's okay when they do it, but when other people do it, it is less okay. And the same goes for taking the bike. It's fine when they do it, relatively speaking, but it is less fine when someone else does it. In sum, expertise in the form of power, it can instill a sense of advantage. Like I said earlier, a sense of advantage is the psychological experience, either implicit or explicit, that the self is valuable. And like I said earlier, which could mean that they think the self is, that they're allowed to behave more selfishly. And I showed this with those studies. They take more resources for themselves. They're more individualistic. They're more self-focused. They're less compassionate, less inclusive, and more hypocritical. So what is the answer to the first question? It's power. what gets in the way of beneficent expert judgment? It could be this feeling of power. And there is not just psychological research or literature that supports this idea. This might be the bedrock of the social sciences, that power corrupts. So we see evidence for this elsewhere. Progressive reformers like McCarthy recognize that experts perform indispensable functions in a complex society, but they were less clear about how to incorporate the professional expertise into democratic decision-making in a way that did not subordinate democratic publics to expert administration. Max Weber was very concerned with this. The dependence of the public and their elected representatives on the expertise of bureaucrats gives experts potentially enormous power. And in the chapter by Chad Goldberg, which I think might have been part of this lecture, if not, I think it might just be a reading in general for the course, he highlights this tension. He asks, how can we be sure that experts will not pursue self-interested goals while pretending to represent the general interest? To sum this all up in an easier way, let's use a meme. So this is from Jurassic Park. I think it nicely sums up the feeling of power. You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could that you did not stop to think if you should. So that is the answer to the first question. Now let's go to the second question. What are the practical methods that organizations can use to lead people to make better decisions? Let me remind you of the Wisconsin idea in quote form. Make people's lives longer, healthier, and happier for self-conscious efforts in both the private and public sectors to improve people's lives, increase freedom, for state and local governments to help citizens do the right thing and to promote socially desirable citizens. Do I need to go on? Do you notice anything peculiar about these quotes? Do you agree that they are about the Wisconsin idea? I'm not getting any kind of communication, so I'll assume that is a consenting yes, and I will respond with, you're all wrong. None of these quotes are about the Wisconsin idea. They resemble the Wisconsin idea. That's why I chose them. And maybe these words have been used before to define and explain the Wisconsin idea, but none of these quotes in particular are about the Wisconsin idea. In fact, they are all goals of behavioral economics. So even if you don't know a thing about behavioral economics or nudges, this should give you a good sense that the goals of behavioral economics are very, very similar to the Wisconsin idea, and that should be encouraging. Here are some actual quotes of the Wisconsin idea. So this time I'm not trying to pull your leg. Let me just read the bolded parts. To make their own decisions and govern themselves most effectively, the bolded parts I think represent and bear close to the quotes of behavioral economics. Promote the well-being of people. Quality of life. Realize their own potential, benefiting the commonwealth. And genuinely self-governing citizens making critical decisions for themselves. So what is behavioral economics? It is carefully designed prompts and activities in the form of nudges that encourage people to make better outcomes, to make better choices by leveraging how they naturally think and feel, which can be more effective and often less expensive alternatives to information and incentives. It is a departure from the traditional economic carrots and sticks approach because it relies on small changes to the choice environment, which can encourage large changes in people's lives. And part of the appeal of using behavioral economics or nudges for both those seeking change and those who are being asked to change is that instead of mandating behavior, instead of limiting behavior, which it does not do, nudges offer people the ability to make their own decisions. Now, what does it look like in practice? Well, it's to benefit people by getting them to make choices that are good for themselves. And the simplest of nudges, the most basic of nudges, is one that takes place in a cafeteria. And instead of placing desserts and unhealthy options in more prominent places, to place the healthier options in those particular places. So it's not as though the desserts and the unhealthy options cannot be chosen or acquired. They are just set aside, slightly to the side, and the other options that people might not ordinarily choose that are especially healthy, they are located in these prominent positions. In Thaler and Sunstein's words, the founders of behavioral economics, you could say, the decision to arrange the food is to encourage nutritious choices. That's a good thing, and positive change, because it influences choices in a way that will make the choosers better off, as judged by themselves. It's not limiting their freedom, it's just making an option that they would not ordinarily choose, it makes it more accessible. Now, broadly speaking, and I only want to talk about this in the broadest of terms because the reading for today's lecture was one of Thaler's articles, but broadly speaking, behavioral economics, it aims to create actionable policy applications of behavioral scientific research that serves the public interest. To me, this is very consistent with the Wisconsin idea. So here is an area of research, an issue of a journal that is about community health and health disparities. Here's another that is about how to foster ethical behavior. Yet another that is about how to get people to vote more, how to engender or how to produce more civic engagement. And also pre-kindergarten interventions. It's involved everywhere. I showed you this earlier, this old article, Helping Cities to Help Themselves. Well, this is another article about 100 years later in the New York Times that is about behavioral economics, and it's got basically the same title, Helping People Help Themselves. There is one big difference between behavioral economics and the Wisconsin idea, and that has to do with information. Information is less prominent, less important in behavioral economics than it is for progressivism or the Wisconsin idea. The former is concerned more with making choices. And you know why, because 2 weeks ago, you all saw Dietram's lecture on information and how information is processed. And what is the gist of that lecture? Information is processed in a very biased way. I shouldn't need to repeat this, but I will anyways, because I have my own fun example. Individuals were asked to evaluate a bill. Some participants were told that the bill was written by Republicans. Others were told it was written by Democrats. And then all participants, on a 1 to 7 scale, they indicated how much they would be in favor of the bill. And as you can see, if people were liberal, then they liked the bill more if they thought it was written by a Democrat versus a Republican, and vice versa for a conservative. Even though, of course, the bill was the same. It had the same information in both of these cases. Now, one assumption of behavioral economics is that people make errors of judgment in the means they use to achieve their ends. They don't always make good decisions. In organizations and governments, they can use interventions like nudges to correct these errors and thus help people achieve better goals, better decisions. Now, experts, what they do specifically is they alter the choice architecture so that those who are less likely to perceive what is good for them can be induced, nudged to choose the options that experts have decided are in their best interests. So this is very reminiscent of the Thaler article. Now, what do I mean by errors of judgment? People know that consumption of fried cheese curds is not conducive to their overall health. People know that they are putting too little money into their retirement funds. Information is not going to help. People already know that. What stands in the way is self-control or temptation. People are often short-sighted, preferring temptation now versus a better option later. And by structuring the choice situation, it becomes easier to correct for these short-sighted actions because the temptation will have less influence. Now, if this feels icky, that's totally fine. It can feel icky to you. It's kind of paternalistic. And this could be something that maybe you discuss in your discussion sections, that there is an ethical dilemma here, that although freedom is not being curbed, there is still something manipulative about this particular approach. So going back, if we contrast the Wisconsin idea with behavioral economics, it's less focused on providing the information, more focused on design and choice architecture, but they are more similar than they are different. They share the goal to improve people's lives. This creates a psychological challenge, however, because determining what is good for people, it's a special problem that I think progressives have who seek policies that are intended to improve people's lives. Those who hold non-progressive conceptions of the state, they have an easier task. It is harder for the progressives to be confident that they know better than individuals by what course of action those individuals can best promote their own well-being. This resembles what in psychology is called an omission bias, which is a heuristic for considering actions to be more impactful than inactions. Consider Cora, a tennis player, and she's facing a tough opponent the next day in a decisive match. Cora knows her opponent is allergic to nuts. What would be worse? If Cora recommends a food containing nuts to hurt her opponent's performance, or if the opponent himself orders the nut allergenic food and Cora says nothing? What's worse? The outcome is the same. The only difference is Cora taking action or is she deciding to do nothing? And it's a bias because despite that the outcome is the same, people believe that Cora taking action is worse. It is more transgressionary than doing nothing. Now, I think that action is more consistent with a progressive policy and that inaction is more consistent with a non-progressive conservative policy. This is not a good versus bad dimension. I'm not saying that one is better, one is worse. All I'm saying is that progressive policies tend to accompany action and that non-progressive policies tend to accompany inaction. We can think about the invisible hand. That non-progressives, they believe that doing nothing is potentially better than doing something, that market forces will sort things out. Again, not saying that one is better than the other, just saying that one is more consistent with action versus inaction. And this means that there could be more of a subjective risk to pursuing a progressive versus a conservative policy because it's harder to tell if doing nothing was a bad decision. But it's easier to tell if doing something was a bad decision. You can think about the difference between selling a stock and keeping a stock. Selling a stock is doing something. Keeping a stock is like doing nothing. And although the outcome can be the same, the outcome can be equally bad when it comes to selling a stock or keeping a stock, people will regret more the decision to sell versus keep, even if the decision in the end is equally bad. Now let's go back to that psychological challenge, because I want to underline this portion, that it is harder for progressives to be confident that they know better than individuals by what course of action those individuals can best promote their own well-being. How can experts know us better when we know ourselves? How do they know more about what makes us happy? And the answer is that no, they actually don't. So there have been studies on gift giving and the kinds of gifts that people receive from other people. They don't value them as highly compared with the choices they make for themselves. So even close friends and family have a difficult time doing any better than the individual in making welfare-enhancing choices. Friends and family are more likely than policymakers to have the local knowledge necessary to make these wise decisions. This provides some evidence of the difficulty that experts face in crafting reforms for other people. And the basic problem is that expert policymakers, they need a baseline, but it's impossible, perhaps, to actually assess the true preferences of other people. So that knowledge of what other people want, what is good for them, can be very hard to access. So the experts themselves, they could have a potentially tenuous grip on the values of the targeted agents, which could limit the direct applicability of their reforms, their suggestions to policy. But even if experts were immune from these psychological effects of power or immune to making incorrect judgments about other people, they can still make mistakes about their own judgment, even about their own expertise, which is to say that expert judgment may be biased too. Here's an example of that. It's a famous example on the conjunction fallacy involving Stanford physicians, people whom we might think to be very good at their particular jobs. In this example, the physicians, they read about a health survey that was conducted in a representative sample of adult males in California of all ages and occupations, and they read about Mr. F, who was included in the sample. And he was selected by chance from the list of participants, and these Stanford physicians were asked which of the following statements is more probable. A, Mr. F has had one or more heart attacks, or B, Mr. F has had one or more heart attacks and he is over 55 years old. The logical right answer is A. That includes more people. It doesn't just include the people who are over 55, it includes everyone who is also under 55. That's more people. So it is more probable that Mr. F belongs to A. But the physicians, they thought that Mr. F was more likely to be in this B category. They were making this judgment about Mr. F that he was quite likely over 55 years old. This leads to a tough question. If experts are likewise prone to making psychological errors of judgments, even when the decisions are related to expertise, that was an example about physicians making physician-related decisions, why should they be good judges of whether a nudge is good for someone else? If policymakers, if they accept the findings of psychology and behavioral economics that make nudging feasible, how are they to determine whether it is desirable? And I think I have an answer to this question. People, they romanticize expertise. They lionize it too much. People, they have this romanticized conception that expert judgment is a central organizational process and the premier force in the scheme of progressive social reform. It amounts to what might be considered a faith in the potential, if not in the efficacy of the experts who occupy the elite positions of formal organizational authority. We should also keep in mind that experts are immune from making mistakes. They aren't immune from making mistakes, and they will sometimes blunder. We can think about the invasion of Iraq or the rollout of Obamacare. So just as regular people may succumb to temptations like desserts or cigarettes that promise short-term pleasures, we should expect progressives and experts to succumb to policy temptations as well that potentially generate selfish gains. I bring up BMI as an example because it's often used, and we see it a lot, despite that there is a well-known belief, at least in the academic community, that it's a terrible measure of health, and yet it's part of our Wisconsin wellness program, so it's like something that we're given, and then we're always provided with this caveat, like, it's no good, just ignore it, it's bad. And if you want to read more, I recommend this particular article about BMI. And altogether, I think these biases render what I consider to be the progressive's dilemma, because the progressive has to be smarter than the target agents, those ordinary citizens that Van Hise notes. The progressive must know their preferences better than they do in order to know just what their difficulties are and how they may be efficiently overcome. But it is not a foregone conclusion that the net effect will be positive. And this is because of power, it's because of bias, it's because of romanticizing and self-interest. Not to mention, there is also a good deal of expert disagreement. They don't always agree on what the best policy is. Decision-making takes place in a social context, and the fact that some people will recognize some distinctions as relevant does not mean that others will. The experts who help create a policy are not necessarily the people who enforce it, who interpret it, or who think about extensions of it. This brings us back to Van Hise's caution. One lesson of behavioral economics is that we cannot reasonably expect experts to carefully consider the full ramifications of their choices in light of the best available evidence. Instead, they might, just like everyone else, economize on information sharing by using choice heuristics. But also, the power, the romanticizing, and self-interest, these are factors that we should consider too, which taken together suggest that we should wonder, in Van Hise's words, if the professors of the university unduly magnify their calling. This leads to an unfortunate paradox. Can we trust the experts' assessments of the experts? Can you trust this whole slide deck? I just relayed it to you. And if we're talking about the drawbacks of experts, maybe we shouldn't trust anything that I said. I was going to end the presentation there, but I thought that's pretty unsatisfying. I normally like to end a lecture on a question, but that didn't seem like a very good question to end on. So I am going to shift gears a little bit to some of the moral pluses and minuses. And this is, do you know what this is? It's the fox and the grapes. And I have the tiny fable here. I don't know if we need to read it all. It's not that long. We just need to note the message. People belittle what they can't have or can't get. The fox wants the grapes. He can't get the grapes. Therefore, he decides the grapes aren't worth getting. Why am I talking about this? Because I think we should question, does the fox actually want the grapes or not? The fox says he doesn't want the grapes, but that's questionable. He did originally want those grapes. It's just a case of cognitive dissonance, so maybe he does really want them. But this is what makes being a progressive especially challenging. Should we help the fox? Do we give the fox the grapes? What is a progressive or an expert or a behavioral economist supposed to do? How do we help the fox? They're saying in this moment they don't want the grapes, but just a moment earlier they did want the grapes. What is it that they want? I'd say that when people have mistaken beliefs about the properties and consequences of alternatives, then they may prefer what is worse, and that's unfortunate. They don't want the grapes. And when they do not understand the alternatives among which they are choosing, their choices and their preferences are going to diverge. My take, the fact that the grapes are good makes helping the fox get the grapes by nudging it worth it. It's a progressive form of Pascal's wager. We don't know what the fox really wants, but the grapes are good, right? So I think the risk is worth it. Therefore, we should help with gusto. Thank you.
Oh, we do have a microphone.
Should we turn on the lights and wake everyone up?
Okay.
Is that the one we're going to use for the questions?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I'll give it back to you. I'm certain there are questions, observations, a number of things. In fact, that was why I started the discussion tonight by saying we've been spending so much time trying to foster the notion of how do we help people? How do we try to advance the Commonwealth? Here are these questions then about expertise that clearly merit attention. So we're going to start. I know there's a question right here.
Who got their hand up? Okay, great.
Hi, I really appreciate your presentation and your material that you shared with us tonight. I work on behalf of the 426 school districts in Wisconsin. And we talk a lot about a couple of things in my work, in my role. One is the algorithms that are prolific on the internet that one interacts with unknowingly, and they make decisions thinking they're making them, but the algorithm is really nudging them to make a particular decision. And this is very frightening for me as a woman and as a citizen. The other thing that what I'm thinking about tonight is the idea that we know better on how to educate children and what classrooms and schools should be like, but we don't make the changes. We just don't go for it. You know, I can tell you right now that the curriculum and the ways people teach are the same that, you know, have been going on for decades. So I'm just trying to position some of this in the progressive form of education, and it's a challenge, and it's my daily work, so that's my only comment.
I think the last two words of this slide, that's my advice. Just do it with gusto. Just do it. Just make the decisions, because you know, oftentimes people are afraid to make a decision. You know, they could be thinking about the downsides, or there's just a bit of a labor to making a decision, and people don't feel like they're in the right mood. But just get over it and make the decision, like make the action happen.
So I'm a professor and an expert in certain things, and I
just said in the last hour that you're wrong.
Yeah, I know, and that's actually
so let me have it.
That's part of my comment, and I'm actually going to talk about something far outside of my expertise. I'm going to talk about rocket science, and I'm not a rocket scientist. So we have experts. And one of the things that gives me the greatest joy in the world, actually out of the world, is are the results of the space program. We've got pictures taken from beyond Pluto toward the sun, showing a little rim of atmosphere around Pluto, and that's spectacular. Now, there's an expertise that goes into that, and I think that's a context in which maybe this sense of expertise isn't controversial. So I'm asking if you if your statements apply to expertise only in a certain context.
And they do. I've definitely been too plucky with my generous assessment of expertise. It's not always negative. I do think that in this advisorship role, then there is some potential for bias. But when it comes to basic research, that's a different kind of expertise. I would consider that to be scientific research. But when it is being used to generate action and to produce policy, we should be at least aware of the potential for bias. I do think that it is, thankfully, this is a silver lining, more of an exception to the rule.
Hi, also a professor here, sociologist. I couldn't help thinking, because I'm a sociologist, about putting it in the broader context of conflicts of interest. I couldn't help but remembering that most behavioral economics is trying to push me to buy Fritos in the grocery store. I mean,
yeah.
You know, it's most of the applications are actually about benefiting the interests of somebody who's trying to sell something or get their workers to work harder or something, right? And so it's consistent with the argument about power. Mm-hmm. So the power, but it does seem like there is a tradition, say in community organizing and stuff, that tries to deal with these issues by attempting to create structures in which the ordinarily less powerful people have more power over what is going to be done and more ability to talk to the experts and create dialogues and stuff. So I'm not sure that's exactly a question, but it's certainly an engagement with the kinds of things you were discussing.
No, I hear you. There's use and then there's misuse. And anytime you can manipulate someone, which is a very negative, pejorative word to be using, but anytime that you can steer someone to make a choice, and maybe it's a good choice, That's a positive thing. Like, people don't vote as much as they should. People don't save as much money as they should. So there are groups of people, behavioral economists, who come up with ways to solve these kinds of problems. The problem is, though, their work can be misused. It can be used to then get people to also buy more Doritos. So on one hand, it's great that we have these ways of steering people to make decisions that they would not ordinarily make. They can also be misused to get people to make decisions like buy Doritos. This man just had a baby. What are you doing here?
I had the power to leave home. I'm also a professor here, so I have a lot of power. Thanks, Evan. Evan is my colleague. And so my question is, sometimes the more we know, the more we understand how much we don't know. Right? And so that could kind of get a situation where knowledge is actually kind of highlights a lack of power.
Yeah.
Right? And so maybe kind of in the context of the contrast with kind of an ordinary citizen, there is like a relatively greater power, but maybe in other contexts of maybe kind of an academic setting where other people also know are at the same level, maybe it's not necessarily, and maybe then you kind of overcome some of the issues that you bring up.
No, I agree completely, and this is something that bugs me about listening to academics on NPR versus politicians. The academics, they're so modest, they're so balanced, and as a result, you're not really that persuaded by the point of view that they are talking about. However, a politician is not nearly as balanced. They're very one-sided and biased, but as a result, they're more persuasive. And so you're right about that, where because the experts, they could be more knowledgeable, they are also perhaps more fair. They understand the downsides of their approach, and they communicate those pros and cons because they just want the information to be as unbiased as possible, but that's not what a politician wants. So I think you're right there. It reminds me a little about the unskilled and unaware effect, that among the people who are very skilled, they're actually the ones who are the most modest, and they underestimate just how skilled they are.
Another of your colleagues. So what about really tough, seemingly intractable social policy problems? So let's take diversity. This university has had a stated policy of increased diversity for a long time, but it's not very diverse. When Brown versus Board happens in '54, and Thurgood Marshall uses the term affirmative action and say we will take action to actually desegregate schools. We end up with a torturous period, and we still have an enormous racial problem. If you could have rewritten, if Thurgood Marshall and Lyndon Johnson and if people could have been behavioral economists, how would they have done it differently, nudging, rather than saying this is the law of the land, or you will bus and you will go to this school, and which set off enormous reactance. So does nudging work at a macro level with intractable problems?
I thought my colleagues were supposed to ask me easy questions. My answer to your question is no. I don't want to overstate the benefits or the reach of behavioral economics. I don't think that it can solve as big a problem such as diversity. I think it can help with problems like financial health and physical health. I don't think that it can do much to help with diversity. We can't end on that note.
Well, no, there was another question or comment.
Oh, but speaking of a nudge, like the EU decided they wanted to have more women in science, so they just started I can't remember exactly what the deal is, but you basically, universities get paid more if they hire women in science positions, so they get more women in science. I mean, a nudge is a nudge, right? I mean, all you have to do is put money where you want to go, and you start going there.
I would actually argue against that. Not that they shouldn't encourage more women in science. I would argue that's not a nudge. I would say that's a financial incentive. And what makes nudges unique is that they don't require financial incentives.
Since we're about ready to wrap up. I'm just certain there are so many questions and comments, and thus we can end so that people can, in fact, come and talk with Evan some more. And the reason why I know there are questions is that if I take the case of the undergraduates in this course, why are you at the university? It's to develop a level of expertise. And if that's the case, then what other kinds of cautions that can be drawn on? Many of the things just that came up just now and a little bit earlier lead us to ask about under what conditions are the particular cautions likely to be appropriate. So making distinctions around areas of expertise or the sets of issues. I just think that there are lots of questions that this discussion certainly would pose for everyone, but I know you're not sitting quietly because you just say, oh, this is another lecture. It's because, as I started by saying, you've been paying attention and you've been asking about the implications of the kinds of commentaries for the lives some of you are already leading and the kinds of directions that others of you intend to take. So please join me in thanking Professor Polman, and I think he will be available for a few other questions or comments in the informal session. Thank you.